JWildfire can render 3D flames as solids with custom materials and lighting to enhance their three-dimensional form. In this video, we'll look at the material settings, which lets us balance the effects of the lights and the flame coloring, and lets us add textures from an image. We'll be using JWildfire version 5.50, the latest one as this video is being recorded. The JWildfire lighting model is based on Phong lighting, a very popular model named for a computer graphics researcher from the University of Utah in the 1970s. The JWildfire version has four components: diffuse light, specular light, ambient light, and a reflection map. Diffuse light is light that comes from a particular direction. It's defined by the lights on the lighting tab. It comes from a particular direction, hits the surface, and bounces off in all directions equally. The brightness of the reflection depends on the angle that the surface is facing compared with the angle the light's coming from. Like the points that face toward the light are brighter than the points that face away from the light. This gives a nice 3D effect. Diffuse is one of the core components of lighting in JWildfire. Specular lighting uses the same lighting as diffuse lighting, but instead of bouncing off in all directions, the light bounces off in a particular direction depending on both the light direction and which direction the surface is pointing. When the reflection points toward the camera, we see a bright spot. This is what provides the little bright spot you see in glossy surfaces. Ambient lighting is very different. It's intended, basically the light comes from all directions. Think of you're in a darkened room or something like that. You have a little bit of light. It's coming from lights that have bounced all over the walls and everything else. It doesn't come from a particular direction. So ambient light affects all points equally, and in JWildfire it gets its color from the flame coloring. That's a little different from traditional Phong lighting, where it just has a constant color, but this allows the flame colors to show through in solid renders in JWildfire. JWildfire extends Phong lighting by adding a reflection map. A reflection map is simply an image in a file that you load in, and it projects it onto the surface. As the name implies, reflection maps are often used for reflecting an environment in a mirrored kind of surface. But I mostly use it for, in JWildfire, adding textures like wood or marble or something. The JWildfire Material Settings tab lets you take the amount of each of these four components and combine them together. Let's go have a look. Here is a 3D solid flame made with Parplot 2D WF. It's a surface called a breather, using preset 23. Since we're focusing on the materials, both the ambient shadows and the hard shadows are turned off. We'll go to the 3D rendering panel into the material settings tab here, and we'll look at the amounts of the four materials right here: diffuse, ambient, specular, and reflection map intensity. The asterisks next to these names here mean that we can change the values without having to re-render the fractal. But it does need to be rendered before we adjust them, so let's click the render button here, render the preview. We can see the progress up here in this little progress bar. When it hits 100%, the flame's been rendered. It still has to do the 3D rendering, so it'll take another few seconds after that, sometimes a little longer. But it's done here. And to begin, let's just set all four values to 0, so we can just try look at one of them at a time. So the result here is just a silhouette against the gray background. Now let's look at how the four light types work individually. We'll start with the simplest, ambient. Let's set ambient to 1. Remember, ambient affects all lights all points of the surface equally, lighting them with the flame color. This flame has a rainbow gradient, and it's applied radially around the surface here. Since ambient light is applied equally, it looks very flat. It doesn't really reveal the nature of the 3D surface. So ambient lighting is great for getting the colors in, but not for really showing off the 3D. The only clue to 3D we have here is the fact that the surface behind this little point here is hidden, and the point on the other side is hidden by the surface. Now, just a side note, the term ambient is also used for ambient shadows, which we don't have enabled here. Like ambient light, ambient shadows are not produced by particular lights, they just darken occluded areas to give to enhance the 3D appearance. So if we enable the ambient shadows and re-render, we can sort of see some shadows appear. So these are the ambient shadows. Notice in the little places here where it's recessed, and right here, it's the surface has darkened a little bit. Those are the ambient shadows. That's not the focus of this video, so let's disable them and render again and go on. Back to material settings. Let's change ambient to 0 and set diffuse to 1. Diffuse light is the light that's defined on the light settings tabs, and we have 2 of them. We're not going to go into light settings on this video, but notice that the surface has a distinct 3D appearance. Since the brightness of the reflected light depends on the direction each point is facing, diffuse light changes with the surface. This is essential for good 3D lighting. It's really the only kind of lighting that brings out the 3D surface. Note there are some colors. These come from the lights. One light is a light blue and the other is a light green. The color you see here are independent of the flame colors added by the ambient light. These colors come only from the diffuse light. The diffuse response setting specifies how the angle between the light direction and the direction the surface is facing is mapped to the light intensity. This is normally done by taking the cosine of that angle. A cosine of 0 degrees is 1, so that lights that face the light are the brightest. The cosine decreases smoothly as the angle increases, until when the angle is 90 degrees, the cosine is 0. This gives a natural shading, and is selected by the diffuse response of cos A for cosine of the angle. There are some other values you can choose here. Cos A square will square the cosine of the angle, which makes the light drop off a lot more rapidly. This exaggerates the curvature of surfaces, and it may be useful for surfaces with a very gentle curve. Now the other two, cos A half and cos A half square, work a little differently. Cos A half makes the response range from 1 to 1/2 instead of to 0. So as soon as it hits 90 degrees, it becomes 1/2 instead of 0, and it abruptly cuts off when the surface faces away from the light. Cos A half square squares that. I'm frankly not sure when I would use those two. Let me know if you found them useful. Let's put it back to cos A, the default setting and the normal setting used by most things. Now let's set diffuse to 0 and specular to 1. This produces some bright spots of light, whose positions depend on both the directions of the light and also which way the surface points are facing. Light 0 produces the spots that are facing up here around the sides, and light 1 produces these dimmer swooshes of light around the circumference of the thing. The top ones here and here also come from light 1, I believe, or light 0, I believe. The spec size setting controls the size of the specular reflections. Although it seems backwards, increasing the setting actually decreases the size of the reflection. So maybe instead of size, think of the setting as the smoothness of a material. A smoother material produces smaller reflections. So a high value like 25, where we can make it even higher, produces very small reflections. A low value, let's try 5, for example, produces much larger reflections because the material, think of the material as being rougher. There's one more specular light setting, the specular color. This is the color that specular reflections will have, and we can change it to anything we want to give whatever effect we want to give there. So just try a couple to show how it works. Normally, I just leave it at white. I like white specular reflections, but of course you can make it anything you want to complement your own fractal. Specular light by itself isn't really very interesting, but it works well with the other types to make a material look glossy. For example, let's set diffuse to 1 and then reduce specular to a lower value like 0.2 that gives a more subtle effect. For comparison, let me turn specular to 0 to turn it off so you can see what the difference is. The final component of JWildfire materials is the reflection map. To show this, I've downloaded an image of a marble surface from pexels.com. There are thousands of texture images available. Just do a web search for the texture you want. Some are free, some cost money, so check the license carefully before you download and use one. You can also take a texture photo yourself and use it as a reflection map in JWildfire. To select the image to use as a reflection map, go down here and click on Select Image. A file browser will open so you can find your image. Select the image you want and either double click it or click the Open button, and it will load the image into JWildfire. When you load a new image, you'll need to re-render the preview so you can see what the effects are. So we click the Render Preview button. While that's rendering, notice the color swatch here by the reflection map label. It was black, now it's sort of an off-white, which is the average reflection map color of the image that we loaded. Let's go turn that on now. Let's turn off diffuse by setting it to 0. And we'll turn the reflection intensity. Setting it to 1 will actually make it too bright. This is a fairly bright image, so let's set it, say, to 0.5. Now we can see that the reflection map, that marble texture we had, is mapped to the surface. The default mapping here is called Blend Newell. There's another one you can choose. It's called Spherical. And rather than get the mathematics behind it, just try them both out, see which one looks better. For this particular image and this particular fractal, I prefer Blend Newell myself. Either way, the result is flat. The brightness of each point depends only on the reflection map and not the direction the point is facing. One really important consideration for using reflection maps is that the image is not stored at the flame, just the file name and the path to the file. This means that if the reflection map image is deleted or moved, the flame won't look the same. Similarly, when sharing the flame with others, you need to share the image too, so they can go and apply it to their render. The recipient will actually have to go and collect the Select Image button and select where they put the file, since the path to the file is probably different from machine to machine. One other thing, be sure to check the license if you're going to use someone else's image. Some licenses allow using, but not sharing, the image file. Now that we've seen how the components work individually by themselves, let's see how to combine them together to make a material in JWildfire. JWildfire simply adds the components together to make the final result, which means that you generally want the values to be smaller if you're having more than one. If the result is a little bit too dark, increase the values a bit. If it's too bright, decrease them. There's a couple ways to approach setting material in JWildfire. If the default values look pretty nice, or if you've done a previous tweak of the things and you like the results, that's a good place to start. Have a look at it and see what needs to change. If the colors are too bright, turn down Ambient a bit. If the 3D shape isn't defined well enough, turn up Diffuse. If the highlights are too gaudy, turn down Specular or change the size. If it needs some texture, add a texture map. Another approach is to start from scratch. Set everything to 0, except Diffuse, put that at 0.5. We set it at 0.5, we're going to add other things, and so that'll give a good starting point. We start with Diffuse because this is a 3D shape and we want to show off that 3D-ness, and Diffuse is the only type of lighting that will do that. So start off with Diffuse, and then if you want to add some color, increase Ambient a bit. If you want to add some texture, add a texture map. Or do both. That works great too. Or you can do neither and just have the one diffuse lighting. In that case, you'll need to increase diffuse a little bit to make up for the fact that that's the only kind of lighting you have. And then add a little bit of specular to add some sparkle to your fractal. Let's go try it out and see how it works. So back in JWildfire, let's set diffuse to 0.5 and set the others to 0. The result's generally dark, but that's fine since we're going to set other values that will add light and make it brighter. But take a close look at it, because if the lights need adjusting, now's the time to do that. Probably want to change diffuse to 1 first, then go in the lighting tab. In this case, an extra light might be useful to add some light to the sides of the veins here. But for the purpose of this video, we'll keep the lights the way they are. The next step is to consider what direction you want to go for additional light. Let's try a couple of different approaches. First, let's try adding reflection map. Since we already have a marble texture loaded, we'll just need to increase the reflection intensity a little bit. It won't take much. It's a pretty bright reflection map, so just a tad, maybe a little bit 0.15 or something like that will do. Now, some specular reflections might be nice, so let's slide up specular a little bit. And the specular reflections seem a bit large. Let's up it to, let's say, 20. Yeah, that looks nicer. And maybe increase the diffuse just a tad. We could go on and adjust things indefinitely until we get what we want, but for now, let's just stop there. That's one possibility. Let's try something else. Again, let's go back to 0.5 for diffuse and 0 for the others. This time, let's add in some of our nice rainbow coloring by turning ambient up. And let's turn it up quite bright, maybe to about, yeah, 0.68, something like that. It's a bit bright, so let's adjust by, let's balance it by decreasing diffuse a bit. Now, we don't really need specular here, but let's try a tiny bit. Maybe let's just type it in manually to like 0.05, just a very tiny bit of specular, and make it larger. I kind of like the way 5 worked here. So that's nice flame. It has bright colors, yet that has a 3D shape that shows well. And of course, we can get more muted colors by turning ambient down. Let's go to, say, yeah, about 0.39, 0.4. Of course, we need to turn diffuse up to make it, again, balance it right. So about 0.65 there. So in this case, we want a little bit more specular. So turn specular up a bit. And we get something that has more muted colors, and I personally kind of like this. Anyway, we'll stop here, but as you can see, the possibilities are endless. We've been looking at a single material, but JWildfire can support multiple materials. We select the one we want to manipulate here in the selected material. By default, there's 2 materials. You can add more by clicking Add, and delete them by clicking Delete. Materials are associated with transforms. This is done on the color tab for the transform. So we only have one transform that has the Powerplot 2D that gives our breather surface, and it has material 0. To demonstrate, we'll add a new transform. We don't need anything fancy, we'll just add a plane. But when adding a new shape that doesn't interact with the others, it's best to put it on its own layer. That gives more flexibility. We can have its own gradient, and we don't have to worry about it interfering with what we already have. So let's go to the Layers panel and add a layer. Then we'll add a new transform. And we'll go to Nonlinear and select the variation as Plane WF. To get it where we want it, let's change the axis to 1 and the position to 7. And I don't particularly like that. Oh, let's go to the color tab and set its material to 1. Notice how it changes what the material, what the plane looks like, because the material is very different. I don't particularly like that gradient. Let's go to gradient and choose another random gradient. That one looks nicer. So let's keep that gradient. Let's click render so we can render the preview so we can adjust the material. Then we'll go back to the 3D rendering panel and choose Material 1. The controls work the same way as before. Increasing diffuse will make it brighter. Decreasing ambient will reduce the colors, and so forth. But the controls, the Material 1 only affects the plane, not the breather surface. So anything that we're changing here is only changing the plane. To change the breather surface, we change back to Material 1, or I'm sorry, Material 0, and these controls affect the breather surface. If you have a solid flame that you've made from several transforms that interact with each other, you can actually set different materials on the different transforms to have different parts of the result have different types of materials. The material speed setting works much like the color speed setting to control how fast the transition happens. I personally have had no success making this work. So if any of you have actually tried this and gotten it to work right, please let me know. I love learning new things. Well, that's it for this video. We haven't talked about the light settings at all. That's a different video. But the material and lighting work together to make the final result. As you're tweaking the appearance of your 3D flame, you'll be switching back and forth between the material tab and the material settings tab and the light settings tab to get your final results. So go on, have fun with materials and making 3D renders. Thank you for watching.